The grand ballroom of Aldoria Palace sparkled under the light of 1,000 crystal chandeliers. Queen Isabella stood at the top of the marble staircase, her emerald gown flowing like water around her feet. Tonight was meant to be a celebration of her 25th year on the throne, but the whispers echoing through the hall told a different story. Princess Camilla, the queen's younger sister, moved through the crowd like a serpent through tall grass. Her scarlet dress was deliberately chosen to outshine the queen's more modest attire. Behind her smile lay years of resentment, years of watching her older sister rule the kingdom that Camilla believed should have been hers. The tradition was clear in Aldoria. The firstborn inherited the crown, regardless of gender. But Camilla had spent decades convincing herself and others that Isabella's gentle nature made her unfit to rule. The kingdom needed strength, she argued, not compassion. Prince Marcus, Isabella's eldest son, stood beside his mother with growing unease. At 28, he had learned to read the political currents of the court better than most. Tonight, something felt wrong. The usual supporters of the crown seemed nervous, and several high-ranking nobles who typically stood close to the queen had positioned themselves near the exits. Lady Catherine, Marcus's wife of 3 years, squeezed his arm gently. She had been born into a noble family, but had always felt more comfortable in the palace library than in the throne room. Her quiet intelligence had made her invaluable to Queen Isabella, who often sought her counsel on matters of state. The evening's entertainment began with traditional Aldorian folk dances, but Catherine noticed how the performers seemed rushed, almost anxious. Even the musicians appeared to be watching the doors more than their sheet music. Duke Roderick, Camilla's closest ally and rumored romantic interest, stood at the far end of the ballroom. His weathered face bore the scars of many battles, and his reputation for ruthlessness had made him both feared and respected throughout the kingdom. Tonight, he wore his military decorations prominently, a not-so-subtle reminder of his power. As the night progressed, Queen Isabella began to notice the strange atmosphere as well. Conversation stopped when she approached groups of guests. Smiles seemed forced, and even her oldest friends appeared uncomfortable in her presence. She caught Marcus's eye across the room, and he nodded almost imperceptibly toward the exit. They had developed this silent communication during years of navigating court politics together. The Queen's personal guard, Captain William, had served the royal family for 15 years. He had fought alongside the Queen during the border conflicts with neighboring Valmont and had sworn his life to protect her. Tonight, however, he found himself watching not just for external threats, but for dangers from within the palace walls. Camilla raised her glass for a toast, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet ballroom. "To my dear sister Isabella," she began, her words dripping with false sweetness, "who has ruled our kingdom with such dedication." The pause before the last word was deliberate, and those who knew Camilla well understood its meaning. The Queen accepted the toast graciously, but Catherine noticed how her mother-in-law's hand trembled slightly as she lifted her glass. Isabella had always been intuitive about people's motivations, and she could sense the shift in loyalty that had been building over recent months. Young Princess Elena, Marcus, and Catherine's daughter, played quietly in the royal nursery upstairs, unaware that her entire world was about to change. At just 5 years old, she represented the future of the Aldorian monarchy, though she was far too young to understand the weight of her bloodline. The palace servants moved through the ballroom with practiced efficiency, but several of them had been approached in recent weeks by Camilla's supporters. Promises of gold and improved positions had swayed some, while threats had convinced others. The very people who had sworn to serve the crown were now preparing to betray it. Lord Chancellor Edmund, the Queen's most trusted advisor, had served 3 monarchs during his long career. His loyalty to the crown was absolute, but at 72, he lacked the physical strength to protect his queen from what was coming. His sharp mind had detected the conspiracy weeks ago, but his warnings to Isabella had fallen on ears that refused to believe her own sister could betray her. The musicians struck up the traditional midnight waltz, and couples began to take their positions on the dance floor. Camilla approached the Queen with an exaggerated curtsy, requesting the honor of the first dance. It was a bold move that caught everyone off guard. In Aldorian tradition, the first dance always belonged to the sovereign and their spouse or heir. Queen Isabella hesitated for just a moment before accepting her sister's hand. As they moved across the polished marble floor, Camilla whispered words that chilled the Queen to her core. "This is the last time you'll dance as Queen, dear sister. Enjoy it while you can." The dance continued, but Isabella's steps became mechanical as the full implications of Camilla's words sank in. Around them, the assembled nobility watched with a mixture of fascination and fear. Some had been bought with promises of wealth and power under Camilla's future rule. Others remained loyal but felt powerless to act. Marcus attempted to move closer to his mother, but found his path blocked by several of Duke Roderick's men. They weren't openly threatening, but their positioning was clearly intentional. Catherine grabbed her husband's arm, her face pale with understanding. Captain William's hand moved instinctively to his sword hilt as he observed the subtle positioning of hostile forces throughout the ballroom. His men were outnumbered, and many of the guards he had trusted for years now wore expressions he couldn't read. The conspiracy was far more extensive than anyone had realized. As the dance reached its climax, Camilla's supporters throughout the ballroom began to move into position. The exits were quietly secured, and loyal members of the court found themselves surrounded by armed men who had once sworn to protect them. The music stopped abruptly, and in the sudden silence, Queen Isabella found herself standing alone in the center of the dance floor, surrounded by enemies who wore familiar faces. The crown that had been her birthright, her responsibility, and her burden for 25 years was about to be torn from her grasp by the one person she had never imagined would betray her. Duke Roderick stepped forward, his voice carrying across the now silent ballroom. "Queen Isabella, by the authority vested in me by the true nobility of Aldoria, you are hereby charged with negligence of duty and unfitness to rule. Your reign ends tonight." The elaborate celebration had become a carefully orchestrated coup, and as Isabella looked into her sister's triumphant eyes, she realized that Camilla had been planning this moment for years. Every family dinner, every shared memory, every expression of sisterly love had been a lie designed to keep Isabella's guard down while Camilla assembled her forces. The guests who had come to celebrate a queen's anniversary found themselves witnessing her downfall instead. The night that was meant to honor 25 years of peaceful rule had become the first chapter in what promised to be a very different kind of reign. The heavy oak doors of the ballroom burst open with a thunderous crash that echoed through the palace corridors. Captain William's worst fears materialized as armed guards wearing Camilla's colors poured into the room. These were not the royal guards he had trained and trusted, but mercenaries and soldiers whose loyalty had been purchased with gold rather than earned through honor. Queen Isabella stood frozen in the center of the ballroom, her emerald gown now seeming like a target rather than a symbol of her majesty. The woman who had ruled Aldoria with wisdom and compassion for a quarter-century found herself powerless as her own palace was seized from within. Marcus lunged forward, desperate to reach his mother, but was immediately restrained by 3 of Roderick's men. His struggles were fierce, but futile against their superior numbers. Catherine screamed his name as she watched her husband being overpowered, her voice cutting through the chaos that had erupted throughout the grand hall. Camilla's transformation was complete and terrifying. Gone was any pretense of sisterly affection or royal decorum. Her scarlet dress now seemed prophetic as she stood like a queen of war, commanding her forces with cold efficiency. "Secure the queen," she commanded, her voice carrying an authority she had never possessed legally but had apparently cultivated in secret. The loyal members of the court pressed against the walls as Roderick's soldiers advanced. Lord Chancellor Edmund, despite his advanced age, positioned himself between the approaching guards and his queen. His frail body shook with indignation as he raised his ceremonial staff of office. "This is treason of the highest order," Edmund declared, his voice carrying the weight of decades of legal knowledge. "The crown cannot be taken by force in Aldoria. The ancient laws." Duke Roderick's backhanded blow sent the elderly chancellor sprawling across the marble floor, blood streaming from his nose. The sight of the kingdom's most respected advisor being struck down shocked even some of Camilla's supporters. Queen Isabella finally found her voice. Though it trembled with emotion, she fought to control. "Camilla, please, think about what you're doing. Our father, our mother, they would be horrified by this betrayal. We are family." Camilla's laugh was bitter and sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. "Family? You've had everything handed to you since birth simply because you emerged from mother's womb 3 minutes before I did. 3 minutes, Isabella. That's the difference between a queen and a shadow." The guards moved closer to Isabella, their chains ready. These were not ceremonial restraints, but heavy iron shackles designed to hold the most dangerous prisoners in the kingdom's dungeons. The symbolism was not lost on anyone present. Camilla intended to treat her sister not as defeated royalty, but as a common criminal. Catherine broke free from the crowd and threw herself at the feet of the approaching guards. "Please," she begged, tears streaming down her face. "She's done nothing wrong. Queen Isabella has been a good ruler. The people love her. You know this isn't right." One of the guards hesitated, clearly moved by Catherine's plea. He had served in the royal guard for 8 years and had personally witnessed Isabella's kindness and wisdom. But Roderick's sharp command brooked no hesitation. "Anyone who interferes will share the Queen's fate," the Duke announced loudly, ensuring his words reached every person in the ballroom. The threat was clear, and even those loyal to the crown found themselves paralyzed by the reality of their situation. Marcus was forced to watch helplessly as the guards seized his mother. Isabella did not resist physically, maintaining her dignity even as the cold iron closed around her wrists. Her eyes found her son's across the chaos, and in that moment, she conveyed both an apology and a final instruction. The crown would pass to him, but he needed to survive to claim it. Princess Elena's nursemaid had heard the commotion from below and was already spiriting the young girl away through the palace's hidden passages. These ancient corridors had been designed centuries ago for exactly such emergencies, though no one had imagined they would be needed against internal threats. The palace servants who had remained loyal found themselves rounded up alongside the nobles who had opposed the coup. Camilla's thoroughness was evident in every detail. She had planned not just to seize power, but to eliminate any potential sources of resistance. Captain William made one last desperate attempt to rally his remaining loyal guards. Drawing his sword, he called out, "For Queen Isabella, for the true crown of Aldoria." A handful of guards responded to his call, but they were quickly overwhelmed by the superior numbers of Roderick's forces. The sound of steel against steel rang through the ballroom as a brief but fierce battle erupted. The marble floor, polished to perfection for the evening's celebration, was soon stained with blood. The contrast between the intended joy of the evening and the horror of its reality was stark and heartbreaking. Isabella was dragged toward the ballroom's main exit, her chains clanking with each forced step. As she passed the portrait gallery that lined the walls, her eyes fell upon the paintings of her ancestors, kings and queens who had ruled Aldoria with honor for over 300 years. The weight of being the one to lose it all pressed down upon her like a physical force. Camilla followed behind the procession, her head held high in premature victory. She had already begun wearing a circlet that belonged to their grandmother, a subtle but clear statement of her intentions. The golden band caught the light from the chandeliers, creating an almost demonic halo around her ambitious face. The ballroom doors swung shut behind the grim procession, leaving chaos and despair in their wake. The celebration that had begun with such hope and grandeur had become a nightmare that would be remembered as the darkest night in Aldorian history. Outside the palace walls, the common people of Aldoria slept peacefully, unaware that their beloved queen was being dragged through her own corridors as a prisoner. The news would reach them soon enough, but, for now, the kingdom remained blissfully ignorant of the treachery that had unfolded within the palace walls. Marcus, still restrained by Roderick's men, watched his mother disappear through the doorway and made a silent vow. This night would not be the end of Isabella's reign, but merely the beginning of his fight to restore her to the throne. The crown might have been stolen, but the true royal line of Aldoria would not be so easily erased. Lord Chancellor Edmund, helped to his feet by sympathetic nobles, wiped the blood from his face and straightened his robes with as much dignity as he could muster. At his age, he had little to lose and everything to fight for. The ancient laws of succession could not be overturned by force, and he would ensure that Camilla's victory remained as illegitimate as her methods. The chandelier light flickered as if responding to the chaos below, casting dancing shadows across the devastated ballroom. The crystal teardrops that adorned the magnificent fixtures seemed prophetic now, as if the palace itself was weeping for what had been lost. As the last echoes of the struggle faded, an ominous silence settled over the ballroom. The coup was complete, but its consequences were only beginning to unfold. The true test would come not in the taking of power but in the keeping of it, and Camilla would soon discover that stealing a crown was far easier than wearing it legitimately. The ancient stone corridors beneath Aldoria Palace had not echoed with such anguish in over 2 centuries. Queen Isabella's footsteps, still bound by the heavy chains that Camilla's guards had fastened around her ankles, created a rhythmic clinking that seemed to count down the final moments of her reign. The dungeons of the palace had been carved from living rock during the earliest days of the kingdom's founding. They were designed to hold enemies of the state, not the state itself. The irony was not lost on Isabella as she was pushed deeper into the bowels of her own castle. Duke Roderick walked beside the fallen queen, his satisfaction evident in every stride. He had spent years planning this moment, years of careful manipulation and secret meetings. His military mind had anticipated every possible resistance, every potential escape route, and every loyal servant who might interfere. "Your Majesty," Roderick said, the title dripping with mockery. "I trust you understand that this is nothing personal. Politics requires difficult decisions, and, unfortunately, you have become an obstacle to Aldoria's future." Isabella's response was measured and dignified, despite her circumstances. "And what future is that, Roderick? One where power is seized through treachery and maintained through fear? That is not the Aldoria our ancestors built." The torchlit passages seemed to grow colder as they descended. Guards flanked the procession, their armor clanking in an irregular rhythm that spoke to their nervousness. Even those who had been bought with Camilla's gold seemed uneasy about imprisoning a woman who had been their queen for 25 years. Meanwhile, in the ballroom above, Catherine had managed to break free from the chaos and was frantically searching for her daughter. The hidden passages that honeycombed the palace had been known to the royal family for generations, passed down from parent to child as both historical curiosity and emergency precaution. Princess Elena was barely awake as her nursemaid, Sarah, carried her through the narrow corridors that ran behind the main walls. Sarah had served the royal family for 30 years and knew every secret of the ancient palace. Her weathered hands shook as she felt along the stone walls, searching for the mechanism that would open the passage to the outside gardens. Marcus had been thrown into the palace's smaller detention chambers, rooms typically used for holding minor criminals awaiting trial. His rage was barely contained as he paced the small cell, his mind racing through possible ways to rescue his mother and reclaim the throne. Captain William lay unconscious in the palace's medical wing, his sword wounds being tended by a physician who wept openly as he worked. The captain had fought valiantly but had been overwhelmed by sheer numbers. His survival was uncertain, but his loyalty had inspired others to consider resistance. Back in the dungeons, Queen Isabella was thrust into a cell that had been prepared specifically for her. The chamber was larger than the typical prisoner's accommodation, but was still a far cry from the royal quarters she had called home for decades. A single torch provided flickering light, and the stone walls were damp with centuries of accumulated moisture. Camilla descended into the dungeons personally, wanting to witness her sister's final degradation firsthand. She had changed from her celebration gown into a practical dress of deep purple, royal colors, but darker and more ominous than Isabella's traditional choices. "Look at yourself, Isabella," Camilla said as she stood outside the cell bars. 25 years of rule, and what do you have to show for it? A kingdom that was willing to abandon you the moment someone stronger appeared. Isabella sat on the rough stone bench that served as the cell's only furniture. Even in defeat, her posture remained regal. "The people didn't abandon me, Camilla. You bought their betrayers and terrorized the rest into silence. There's a difference between conquest and consent." The exchange between the sisters revealed the deep philosophical divide that had always existed between them. Isabella believed in ruling through inspiration and example. Camilla had always favored control through strength and fear. Young Elena had been successfully spirited out of the palace and was being taken to the cottage of Thomas, the royal groundskeeper. Thomas had served the crown faithfully for 40 years, and his isolated home on the edge of the royal forest would provide temporary safety for the child, who was now third in line to the throne. The news of the coup was spreading beyond the palace walls despite Camilla's attempts to control information. Messenger ravens had been dispatched to loyal nobles in distant provinces before the palace was completely secured. The response would take time, but word of Isabella's imprisonment was already traveling across the kingdom. Lord Chancellor Edmund, despite his injuries, was working frantically in his chambers to document the illegality of Camilla's actions. The ancient laws of Aldoria were clear about succession, and no amount of force could make Camilla's seizure of power legally binding. His quill scratched across parchment as he prepared formal challenges to the coup. In the servants' quarters, a quiet rebellion was already forming. The palace staff who had remained loyal were secretly organizing to help any resistance efforts. Cook Martha, who had prepared meals for 3 generations of the royal family, was already hiding weapons and supplies that might be needed later. Camilla made her way to the throne room, where Duke Roderick was supervising the removal of Isabella's personal effects. The queen's crown sat on a side table, its jewels catching the light from the ornate windows. For all her planning and ambition, Camilla hesitated as she reached for it. Having second thoughts? Roderick asked, noticing her pause. No, Camilla replied firmly, lifting the crown and feeling its weight. I'm simply savoring the moment. This crown should have been mine from birth. The coronation ceremony would need to be planned carefully. Camilla needed to present her rule as legitimate to both her own people and to foreign kingdoms that might question her authority. The crown was only as powerful as the recognition it commanded. Meanwhile, in the provinces surrounding the capital, several noble houses were receiving the secret messages about the coup. Lord Benedict of the Northern Territories had served alongside Queen Isabella during the Valmont conflicts and owed his life to her strategic brilliance. His response to the news would set the tone for much of the kingdom's rural nobility. Catherine had finally reached her daughter's hiding place and was holding Elena close as they planned their next moves. The little girl didn't fully understand why they were hiding or why her grandmother was in trouble, but she could sense the fear in her mother's voice. Back in the dungeon, Isabella closed her eyes and tried to find peace in the chaos. She had always known that the crown came with risks, but she had never imagined that the greatest threat would come from within her own family. The cold stone walls seemed to whisper the names of all the monarchs who had ruled before her, and she wondered if she would be remembered as the queen who lost everything. The first night of Camilla's rule was ending, but the true test of her power was just beginning. Seizing a throne through force was one challenge. Keeping it while facing the resistance of a kingdom's loyal subjects would prove to be entirely another. The dungeons held a queen, but they could not contain the loyalty she had earned or the legitimacy she represented. As dawn approached, the palace that had been a symbol of stability and tradition for centuries now stood as a monument to ambition and betrayal. The sun would rise on a kingdom transformed, but whether that transformation would endure remained to be seen. Dawn broke over Aldoria with an ominous red sky that the palace servants whispered was an ill omen. The ancient superstition claimed that when the sun rose blood red over the royal castle, great change would follow. Today, that superstition seemed prophetic as news of the palace coup began spreading throughout the kingdom like wildfire. Camilla stood at the great window of the throne room, still wearing the crown she had claimed just hours before. The weight of it felt different than she had imagined during all those years of coveting it. Gold and jewels that had seemed so desirable now pressed down upon her head with an almost crushing burden of responsibility and expectation. Duke Roderick entered the throne room with urgent news. "My queen," he said, testing the new title, "we have reports of resistance forming in 3 provinces. Lord Benedict has refused to acknowledge your rule, and the coastal lords are demanding proof of Isabella's willing abdication." The reality of ruling by force was becoming clear to Camilla. Taking power had been the easy part. Maintaining it would require constant vigilance and increasingly harsh measures. She turned from the window, her expression hardening with resolve. "Then, we will provide them with proof," Camilla declared. "Bring my sister to the throne room. She will publicly renounce her claim and endorse my rule." In the dungeons below, Queen Isabella had spent the sleepless night in meditation and prayer. The cold stone floor had served as her bed, but her spirit remained unbroken. She understood that Camilla would eventually demand a public surrender, and she had spent the dark hours preparing for that moment. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the dungeon corridors. Isabella rose gracefully from her makeshift bed, straightening her torn and stained gown as best she could. Even in captivity, she would maintain her dignity and bear herself as a queen. Captain William had regained consciousness in the medical wing, though his wounds were severe. The old soldier's first thoughts were of his duty to the crown. Despite the physician's protests, he was already attempting to rise from his bed, driven by loyalty that pain could not diminish. "Captain, you must rest," the physician pleaded. "Your injuries are serious, and movement could—" "My queen needs me," William interrupted, his voice weak but determined. 25 years of faithful service does not end because of a few sword cuts. Meanwhile, Catherine and young Princess Elena had spent the night in the groundskeeper's cottage, planning their escape from the kingdom. Thomas had prepared a wagon and provisions for their journey to the neighboring realm of Astoria, where Catherine's sister lived in exile. "Mama, when will we go home?" Elena asked, her innocent eyes reflecting confusion about the night's events. At 5 years old, she could sense danger, but couldn't comprehend the full scope of what had happened to her family. Catherine knelt beside her daughter, struggling to find words that would be both truthful and age-appropriate. "We're going on an adventure, sweetheart. We'll visit Aunt Margaret for a while, and, hopefully, we'll be able to return home soon." Back in the throne room, preparations were being made for Isabella's forced appearance. Camilla had decided that a public ceremony was necessary to legitimize her rule. The Great Hall was being prepared for an audience of carefully selected nobles and citizens who would witness the supposed abdication. Lord Chancellor Edmund, despite his injuries from the previous night, was being forcibly brought to the throne room as well. His presence would lend legal weight to any documents that Isabella might be compelled to sign. However, the old chancellor's mind was working frantically to find loopholes in any agreement Camilla might force upon his true queen. The doors to the throne room opened with ceremonial grandeur as Queen Isabella was escorted in chains to face her sister. The assembled crowd gasped at the sight of their beloved monarch in shackles, many of them only now truly understanding the magnitude of the previous night's betrayal. Isabella walked with measured steps, her head held high despite her bonds. She had ruled this kingdom for a quarter-century, and she would not allow Camilla's treachery to diminish her in the eyes of her people. Every step was a statement of defiance and dignity. Camilla sat upon the throne that had been her sister's for so many years, the crown gleaming upon her head in the morning sunlight. The dramatic contrast between the two sisters was stark, one elevated and adorned with power, the other bound and humbled, yet somehow maintaining greater majesty. "My dear subjects," Camilla began, her voice carrying across the silent hall, "you have been gathered here to witness a historic transition. Queen Isabella has realized that the burden of rule has become too great for her, and she wishes to pass the crown to someone with the strength to lead Aldoria into the future." The lie was so bold and obvious that several members of the audience shifted uncomfortably. Isabella's reputation for strength and dedication was well known throughout the kingdom, and the idea that she would voluntarily surrender the throne strained credibility. Isabella was brought to stand before the throne, and, for a moment, the two sisters simply stared at each other. 25 years of shared history, of family bonds that had once been real and precious, seemed to hang in the air between them. "Isabella," Camilla said, her voice taking on a false tone of sisterly concern, "please tell our people of your decision to abdicate in my favor." The moment of truth had arrived. Isabella could feel the weight of expectation from every person in the room. She could choose to resist and face unknown consequences, or she could comply and spare herself and potentially others from Camilla's wrath. When Isabella spoke, her voice rang clear and strong throughout the great hall. "I have served as Queen of Aldoria for 25 years, and in all that time, I have never once acted against the interests of this kingdom or its people. I have never broken a sacred oath, never betrayed a trust, and never seized what was not rightfully mine." The words were carefully chosen, and their meaning was not lost on anyone present. Isabella was not acknowledging Camilla's right to the throne. She was highlighting the contrast between legitimate rule and usurpation. Camilla's eyes flashed with anger at her sister's defiance. "You will recognize my authority as queen, or you will face the consequences of your stubbornness." "The only authority I recognize," Isabella replied calmly, "is that which flows from the ancient laws of our kingdom and the consent of our people. Neither has made you queen, Camilla." The tension in the throne room was palpable as the two women faced each other in a battle of wills. The assembled nobles and citizens watched in fascination and horror as the royal family tore itself apart before their eyes. Duke Roderick stepped forward, his hand moving to his sword hilt in an obvious threat. "Your Majesty," he said to Camilla, "perhaps the former queen requires more time to consider her position." The implications were clear to everyone present. Camilla had the power to make Isabella's life extremely unpleasant, and she was not above using that power to achieve her goals. Isabella met Roderick's threatening gaze without flinching. "I have considered my position very carefully, Duke. I am the rightful queen of Aldoria, and no amount of force or intimidation will change that fundamental truth." The standoff continued for several tense moments before Camilla realized that she would not achieve her desired public abdication. Isabella's courage was inspiring murmurs of support from some members of the audience, and the longer the confrontation continued, the more it highlighted the illegitimacy of Camilla's rule. Very well, Camilla said finally, rising from the throne. If you will not willingly pass the crown to its rightful owner, then history will record that it was taken from an unworthy ruler by popular demand. As Isabella was dragged back toward the dungeons, she managed to catch the eye of Lord Chancellor Edmund. In that brief moment of eye contact, she conveyed a message that the old lawyer understood perfectly. The fight was far from over, and legal challenges to Camilla's rule were already being prepared. The morning's failed ceremony had not gone as Camilla had planned. Instead of legitimizing her rule, it had highlighted the courage of the deposed queen and the questionable nature of the coup. As she sat upon the throne she had coveted for so long, Camilla was beginning to understand that wearing a stolen crown came with consequences she had not fully anticipated. 3 weeks had passed since the night that changed Aldoria forever, but the kingdom had not settled into acceptance of Camilla's rule as she had hoped. Instead, resistance was growing stronger with each passing day, and reports of rebellions in the outer provinces were arriving at the palace with alarming frequency. Queen Isabella remained in the palace dungeons, but her imprisonment had become a symbol of resistance rather than defeat. Songs about the captive queen were being sung in taverns throughout the kingdom, and secret meetings of loyal nobles were being held in hidden locations across the realm. Camilla stood before the great map in the war room, studying the red marks that indicated areas of active rebellion. Duke Roderick pointed to the newest reports with growing frustration. The northern territories have declared independence under Lord Benedict, Roderick reported grimly. The coastal provinces are refusing to pay taxes, and 3 merchant guilds have suspended trade with the capital. Your rule is being challenged on every front. The stress of wearing a stolen crown was evident on Camilla's face. Dark circles under her eyes spoke of sleepless nights, and her once confident demeanor was showing cracks. Ruling by fear required constant vigilance, and increasingly harsh measures that were alienating even her supporters. Then, we must demonstrate the consequences of defying royal authority, Camilla declared, her voice taking on a harder edge than it had possessed even during the coup. Select the most rebellious village in the northern territories, and make an example that the others will not forget. The order to use military force against her own people marked a new low in Camilla's reign. Duke Roderick nodded grimly, understanding that the civil war everyone had hoped to avoid was now inevitable. In the dungeons, Isabella had become the unofficial leader of the imprisoned loyalists. Lord Chancellor Edmund, despite his age and injuries, spent his days teaching younger nobles about the legal foundations of legitimate rule. Captain William, still recovering from his wounds, was training other prisoners in military tactics for the day when resistance might turn to open rebellion. The cell that held Queen Isabella had become a meeting place for whispered discussions about the kingdom's future. Even in captivity, her natural leadership abilities shone through, and other prisoners looked to her for guidance and hope. We must be patient, Isabella counseled during one of their secret meetings. Camilla's rule is built on force and fear, and such foundations are inherently unstable. She will make mistakes, and when she does, we must be ready to act. Catherine and Princess Elena had successfully reached Astoria, where Catherine's sister Margaret provided them with sanctuary in her remote manor house. The journey had been perilous, with Camilla's agents searching for them throughout the kingdom, but Thomas the groundskeeper had guided them safely across the border. News from Aldoria reached them through a network of smugglers and merchants who maintained contact across the border. Each report brought both hope and despair. Hope that resistance was growing, despair that the kingdom was sliding toward civil war. Aunt Margaret, young Elena asked during breakfast, "When can we go home? I miss grandmother Isabella." Margaret exchanged a meaningful glance with Catherine before answering carefully. "Soon, little princess. Your grandmother is very strong, and I believe she will find a way to come back to you." Back in Aldoria, the first open battle between Camilla's forces and the rebels took place in the village of Millbrook. Lord Benedict had fortified the town as a symbol of resistance, and when Roderick's army arrived to crush the rebellion, they found the villagers prepared to fight for their true queen. The battle was brief, but bloody. The villagers, though brave, were no match for professional soldiers, and, by evening, Millbrook was burning. However, the victory came at a terrible cost to Camilla's reputation. Word of the destruction spread quickly, and even some of her remaining supporters began to question the price of maintaining power. In the palace, Camilla received news of the battle with mixed emotions. The rebellion had been crushed, but the images of burning homes and dead villagers haunted her dreams. This was not the glorious rule she had envisioned during all those years of planning her coup. Duke Roderick returned from Millbrook with troubling news beyond the tactical details of the battle. The rebels fought with unusual coordination, he reported. They had detailed knowledge of our troop movements and seemed to be following a specific strategy. Someone with military experience is organizing the resistance. The implication was clear. Marcus, Isabella's son and rightful heir, was likely alive and leading the rebellion from somewhere beyond their reach. Camilla had assumed he had been killed or captured during the coup, but it appeared he had escaped and was now rallying opposition to her rule. Deep in the palace dungeons, a new plan was taking shape among the imprisoned loyalists. Captain William had discovered that several guards were becoming sympathetic to their cause, horrified by the violence being used against innocent civilians. The possibility of rescue was beginning to seem less like a fantasy and more like an achievable goal. The Feast of St. Aldoric is in 5 days, Lord Chancellor Edmund whispered during one of their clandestine meetings. Traditionally, the ruler grants pardons to prisoners as an act of mercy. If Camilla follows tradition to appear legitimate, we might have an opportunity. Isabella nodded thoughtfully. The feast day would require public ceremonies, and public ceremonies meant opportunities for both rescue and demonstration. If they could turn Camilla's attempt at legitimacy against her, they might be able to expose the true nature of her rule to the people. Meanwhile, in a hidden camp in the Aldorian forest, Marcus was indeed organizing a coordinated resistance. The young prince had gathered a force of loyal knights, dispossessed nobles, and common soldiers who refused to serve under Camilla's banner. Their numbers were growing daily as word spread that Isabella's heir was alive and fighting. We cannot defeat Roderick in open battle, Marcus explained to his war council around a campfire deep in the woods. But we can make Camilla's rule so costly that her own supporters will abandon her. Every village she burns, every innocent she imprisons, turns more people against her. The strategy was working. Reports of civilian casualties and harsh reprisals were reaching foreign kingdoms, and several neighboring rulers were beginning to express concern about the situation in Aldoria. The legitimacy that Camilla craved was slipping further away with each act of violence. Catherine, safe in Astoria but desperate for news of her husband, had begun her own quiet campaign. Using her family connections and diplomatic training, she was working to convince foreign powers to intervene on behalf of the legitimate monarchy. Her efforts were subtle but potentially crucial to the larger resistance effort. As the Feast of St. Aldoric approached, all the various threads of resistance and rebellion were converging on what promised to be a pivotal moment in Aldorian history. Camilla's rule, built on betrayal and maintained through violence, was facing its greatest test. In the dungeons, Isabella prepared for what she sensed would be a crucial day. 3 weeks of captivity had not broken her spirit but had instead strengthened her resolve. She had seen the true cost of illegitimate power, and she was more determined than ever to reclaim her throne, not for herself, but for the people who were suffering under Camilla's harsh rule. The crown that Camilla wore had become a burden rather than a prize, and the kingdom she had seized was slipping through her fingers like sand. The Feast of St. Aldoric would determine whether her rule could be stabilized or whether the forces of legitimacy and justice would finally prevail. As torches flickered in the dungeon corridors and plans were whispered in the shadows, the stage was set for a confrontation that would determine the future of Aldoria. The stolen crown's days were numbered, and the true test of royal blood, not in birth but in character, was about to begin.